Well, to get started, I'd like to kind of poll the audience with a quick question. If you can, please raise your hand if you think you can explain what belonging is to a 5-year-old. Okay, we got a couple folks feeling pretty confident that they can rise to that challenge. A couple folks maybe not so sure. Definitely a few folks doing their part to participate before an upcoming break. I see you, still appreciate you. Fantastic. Explain It Like I'm 5 is a popular trend, if you're not aware of it, that's really taken off these days, especially in spaces where people are teaching technical concepts. This trend, however, feels a little bit different to someone who's literally been teaching 5-year-olds for years. Hard press, there you go. Awesome. Well, I was a classroom teacher before I entered the tech space, and there was a lot of feeling like I didn't belong during that shift in my career. And even before that, if I can be completely honest. I'm a first-generation American born to a Pakistani Muslim family who was born and raised in South Florida. And if you're not aware of the demographic of South Florida, it's pretty diverse, but it's a predominantly Latina Hispanic community. So growing up, issues kind of figuring out where I truly belonged followed me like a shadow. That's why when I finally got a chance to become a classroom teacher, I cared a whole lot about setting an inclusive classroom culture where everyone could say that they felt welcomed and celebrated. Including rabbits, because sometimes my rabbits did tag along with me as an incentive for warm and fuzzy behavior. Warm and fuzzy behavior, as I defined it, was really anything that you could do to help somebody else feel welcomed. So not only did I set an expectation for warm and fuzziness among my students, but as their classroom leader, I actively modeled what it looked like in the space that we all shared. And if you're wondering, all the way on the right there is an image of a kiddo who is reading for the very first time to one of my rabbits. Super precious, I know, very proud teacher moment for me. One of the ways that I loved celebrating and representing my students was through dance parties or dance-offs. If we ever needed a break from the heavy expectations and burdens of our school day, of which there are many, as I'm sure any teacher will tell you, or if we were celebrating a group accomplishment, Miss Sattar, as I was known back then, would throw on a carefully curated playlist of songs chosen by students. During our dance parties, students would form a circle and kind of dance in place, usually to Kids Bop. So you can imagine how wild that got. Every now and again, a student might get a little extra hype and jump in the middle, tap in their friend, and take turns in the spotlight this way. There was always an option not to dance and celebrate in different ways at other stations, or if you were a kid that wanted to dance, you could opt not to be tapped in. It kind of always depended on how comfortable students felt. This was always a blast, and I can tell you with confidence that these kiddos really looked forward to our dance parties, especially when their contributions were part of the fun. So what do my dance parties have to do with belonging and DEI? Well, there's an analogy that was coined by Verna Myers in her TED Talk, How to Overcome Our Biases, which compares DEI to a party setting. She says, diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. Another genius in this DEI space, Dr. Jeff Hutchinson, notes that this analogy leaves some room for us to think about equity and where that fits in. He suggests that equity would be like installing a wheelchair ramp to the front door of that party venue. So if we anchor ourselves to this party analogy to wrap our brains around DEI, then where does the B for belonging fit in? I'd like to mention as an aside that there could be folks in this audience and definitely somewhere on the internet who are saying to themselves, great, another letter for this acronym? I'm already barely keeping up. Is it really necessary? To that, I can say that new letters get added to acronyms like DEI and even LGBT because, well, we're intelligent beings and we learn as we grow. The more we learn, the more we add to our schemas. API pun intended. We should always strive to keep our learning caps on and make it clear that not only are we ourselves always learning, but we gotta provide others the grace to learn too. So now that we've addressed that, yes, in fact, humans do learn, let's get back to thinking about this DEI party analogy. If diversity is having a variety of folks present at the party, equity is making sure everyone's able to attend, and inclusion is being asked to dance, where does the B for belonging fit in? Well, to figure that out, we first have to truly understand the meaning of belonging, because once we understand what it means, then we can have our, oh yeah, I guess it's not the same as inclusion moment. To emphasize, belonging is not the same as inclusion. Inclusion, as the Oxford Dictionary defines it, is the practice or policy of providing opportunities or resources. Belonging is a sense of fitting in or feeling like an important member of a group. So once you're included at the party, do you see your contributions as meaningful? Do the dance hits that represent you make it into that playlist that everyone's dancing to? And how does that all translate into the workplace? DEI and B is something that many organizations are working hard to get right, especially in recent years following movements for social justice. So what happens when the sense of belonging is missing at an organization, especially for marginalized social groups? Well, marginalized groups and people of color often become victims of several aggressions. Here's a flowchart which was first shared with me by Shauna Curran, founder and CEO of STEM Energy, a career pivot program for women of color. In the flowchart, you can see how a woman of color first enters an organization or a workplace and feels welcomed. This is often, these days, due to recruitment efforts and increasing pressure to hire more diverse employees. We can sometimes consider this a tokenized hire. In time, the employee experiences several microaggressions. These can be things like having her name confused with any number of the handful of other employees of color at the company, or maybe having her comments and behaviors described as aggressive or angry. Maybe she gets asked questions that make her feel like the other, like, where are you really from? Microaggressions don't feel like overt racism or discrimination to the aggressor, but they serve to exclude the victim, forcing the person of color to feel like they don't belong. This is what we call intent versus impact, because sometimes the aggressor doesn't intend to exclude individuals or make anyone feel bad. But at the end of the day, the outcome was that the victim felt excluded. That's the impact of the aggressor's actions, and it takes work to address that. Often that work falls on that person of color. When this continues beyond the victim's comfort level, you can see in the chart that the woman of color is going to point out these issues. She may volunteer to help educate others in lots of different ways at the organization. The organization then falls into a pattern of denial and inaction. And ultimately, the woman and people of color's motivation to support organizations like this dwindles to a breaking point. And sometimes they're eventually forced out. But what happens and what does it look like when employees feel like they do belong? I'm sure some of you are expecting me to say that companies that are getting it right are having daily dance parties. And you know what? They very well could be. But according to Chang and Groisberg and their research for an article in the Harvard Business Review, successful organizations are fortifying their initiatives with a culture of learning. In essence, organizations that feel like a place of learning are the ones where employees are saying that they feel like they belong. So what are some of the things that we see at these organizations that have a strong culture of learning? What are some of those concrete examples? Here's an abridged list inspired by the authors of Culture Amp's ebook, 6 Ways to Foster Belonging in the Workplace. I have selected 3 of the 6 strategies, and the first on my list is regular data gathering from employees about what they feel is going well and what they think can be improved. We wear our learning caps in the workplace when we really want to learn from each other. At a previous company, our HR team used 15-5 surveys to measure employee satisfaction. This provided the team some real, actionable data points on a consistent basis. And data points like this could be pretty meaningful when we strategize how to act on them, and then act on them. Second on my list is team building, but team building as a priority. Look at that, there's an opportunity for dance parties. Where there's a will, there's a way. But seriously, some companies set team building up for success through affinity groups or employee resource groups, known as ERGs. These groups have helped folks connect on causes and values. They've also created opportunities for allies. Affinity groups have been some of the greatest assets for boosting company culture during the pandemic, when many employers were going fully remote for the very first time. Last on my list, and certainly not least, a shared vision. When a group collectively keeps a shared vision and goals in mind, they're more likely to see their professional journeys as shared journeys. James Kouzes and Barry Posner, in their article, To Lead, Create a Shared Vision, shared some study findings in which folks highlighted that forward-looking is an attribute of true leaders. So we're seeing that folks also appreciate when their leaders can acknowledge and highlight that clear vision. This can be achieved through regular all-hands meetings or company-wide stand-ups, where everyone's periodically realigned on that shared vision and a forward-looking path. So what if I can see that my organization has some room for growth regarding belonging? Where do I even start to have these conversations that affect change? I think it's important to mention that no matter how lighthearted my approach to discussing DEI&B, DEI&B itself is rooted in humanitarianism, which is to honor human lives with respect and dignity. DEI&B deserves careful attention and has to be a priority in any organization that includes human lives, which I would argue is pretty much every institution that we know. My firm belief is that DEI&B conversations and planning have to live in educational settings, workplaces, anywhere where humans are coming together. Why? Because it's kind of unrealistic to think that we'll only ever come across people who look, sound, and think just like us. In order for us to progress and grow as a society, to affect that change and even innovate, we have to acknowledge what society is composed of. And much of that is different from ourselves. And yes, learning about those differences is sometimes really uncomfortable. I get it. Sitting in a room where the expectation is to discuss DEI&B can make some folks who identify as risk-averse or non-confrontational want to disappear right into the walls. I've been in organizations where folks have even said that they wish they didn't need to have DEI&B shoved down their throats, which is a pretty wild way, I feel, to describe the discussion of something that, at its core, like we mentioned, is trying to achieve peaceful humanitarian goals. When leaders can agree that DEI&B work is a constant learning process and really anywhere is a great place to start to foster that culture of learning, then we can begin mapping the road ahead. So keep your learning caps on in all of your interactions and know that others have their invisible learning caps on too. Then find ways to promote the celebration of yourself and the diverse folks around you. If a strong culture of learning helps folks feel like they belong, then I would argue that maybe we should treat all spaces like classrooms, a place for learning. And if belonging is like contributing to the party playlist, then I ask you to contribute the songs that speak to who you are to a shared playlist. Like the one that I set up for all of us to enjoy while we're at this conference, or at least during our upcoming break. Here's an invitation link that you can use to start adding to our shared playlist on Spotify. With that, I hope you all have your shot at being in the spotlight and can share the opportunity to be in that same spotlight with your colleagues every day. Thank you.